Hi, Eli.
Bob,
How
I'm
you
back.
doing?
Hello.
It's been too long.
From Baghdad. It has been too long, and I'm glad to do it.
Let's be clear who's in Baghdad. I am not Baghdad, Bob. You are Baghdad, Eli. You are in Baghdad.
I'm at the Babylon Hotel right now, which is where I've stayed here when I've been out, but this is the base. It's quite nice.
Uh-huh. And you are going to grace us with your insights into what's going on there. You are now with Bloomberg View. You're writing up a storm. I've been reading some of your stuff for Bloomberg View. Last time you were with us, I think you were at the Daily Beast, but then I assume there was some kind of bidding war for your services.
It was Josh Rogan and my kind of reporting partner and I are happy to be at the View, though I don't have any bad words to say about the Daily Beast.
Good.
I like the Daily Beast was great. I consider it in still ways. I read it every day, and I hope the Blogging Heads viewers read it too.
That was very judiciously handled, Eli.
But the Bloomberg View is great too. You should be reading that, and there are Blogging Head alum like Megan McArdle who write for us, Ramesh Pernuru. So I'm sure a lot of familiar names. And
David Shipley, your Jefe Absoluto or whatever at Bloomberg View is an old friend of mine, and actually a friend of Blogging Heads and
great guy.
So on.
And a great boss. And I should point out that I thought to do this from Baghdad because in 2007 we did 3 of these during the surge. It was a hotter topic, I think, in the news at the time. But kind of coming back, I thought it was a good idea to sort of to check in. Do you remember those?
I do. Well, I more specifically, I remember. I mean, give yourself some credit. You Blogging Heads actually reported what came to be called the Anbar Awakening, right?
Yeah.
Before the New York Times, honestly, and it was because you were on from Iraq, and you talked about it.
And I remember writing for the New York Sun at the time, which is still online, and kind of checking in with you, and it was like I was like filing, and it was an exciting moment.
It was.
And I remember I was more optimistic than a lot of Americans and a lot of the viewers at the time. And I think the surge did have this very good effect, but it's all squandered.
Things are not looking that great. No. So let's talk about that now. The last piece of yours that I read in Bloomberg View is called "Iran's militias are taking over Iraq's army." Tell us about that.
Yes, I mean, for the sake of a headline, it's really Iran-backed militia. They're not Iranian militias per se, but the leadership and a lot of these militias are very much tied to the Iranians. They're in some ways equipped and advised by a guy by the name of Qasem Soleimani, who some people may know. He is the head of the Iranian Quds Force, who was a major enemy of U.S. Military, when we last spoke from Baghdad. These militias, I think this piece will be out by the time this comes out, but these militias, a lot of people think this started after the fall of Mosul in June, when you saw the Iraqi army collapse in Kirkuk and Mosul, which is the second largest city, and Kirkuk is one of the more important cities. And then there was a kind of public statement from Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who is the leading clerical authority of all of Shiism, and I should say is not in any way controlled by Iran, and has been seen over the years.
He is himself Iraqi, right? He is an Iraqi Shia.
He's Iraqi. He's based in the Hausa of Najaf. And I should say that Sistani was always somebody who actually was a very positive influence from the perspective of the U.S. military in the last decade, because he urged Iraqis to support the military and to vote in the elections. And unlike other clerical figures who without as much authority like Muqtada al-Sadr, he did not call for a kind of uprising in the same way. So it's significant that in the absence of U.S. military and the collapse of the Iraqi army, that even Sistani had called for what the Iraqis call these volunteers. And in some ways, you can't blame them. So a lot of people who kind of were going to go to college or were, running a grocery or doing all kinds of things in Iraq, stopped what they were doing if they were a fighting age. And I've met fighters in their 50s. So that's like from your 20s to your, I guess you could say your very early 20s to your 50s. It's a lot of people. And they, there's a chant where they say, roughly translated, crush ISIS and honor Sistani. So that is largely seen. It's kind of popular. That's what started this push towards the militias. A lot of these militias already kind of existed, but their prominence was largely seen as after that. But actually, the plan starts in April of last year. When
can I just interrupt and review for our home viewers? I mean, so these, like the Badr Brigade or whatever, people may remember for the Iraq War as one of the enemies of the United States as part of the insurgency that was opposed to the American occupation.
It's a little complicated with Badr Corps, other groups much more so, but yeah.
Okay, I mean, so the Shia militias were our enemies. Right. But now that you have what is largely a Shia government in Iran, although of course we're encouraging as much kind of cross-sectarian outreach and involvement as possible. And I actually think we should get to this later, but I think Iran has kind of encouraged a little of that. At least they encouraged a less polarizing prime minister. They wanted to get rid of the old guy, right?
No, that's not what I'm hearing.
You're not.
This is a hard thing to report, so I'm probably not going to write it. But I've heard that they wanted Maliki. They were obviously upset because Maliki was not only corrupt but incompetent. But they wanted Maliki in the end, and Abadi was. I mean, listen, it was a compromise.
Yeah, they withdrew support from a lot for.
Well, but it wasn't. I would have disputed with you a few years ago, Iran runs Iraq. The influence now is much more. I mean, you can, first of all, it's extraordinary to see in a country that in the 80s fought Iran bitterly. Even though that was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, I mean, most Iraqis fought in that war, including Shia Arabs. Now you can find almost everywhere in Baghdad huge posters of Ayatollah Khomeini or the current supreme leader Khamenei, and you find them and this is the thing that's very interesting, they usually are in the corner of a poster that features the face of a martyr, someone who was killed in battle against ISIS. So I was last year at the very end of 2009. I didn't see that last time I was here.
So the Iraq War converted Iraq from a bitter enemy of Iran's into what may verge on a client state of Iran's. Maybe that's overstating it, but the gist of your reporting is that yes, these Shia militias that were our enemy during the Iraq War are certainly in coordination or whatever with Iran. They take advice from Iran even if they're not under Iran's control. Nominally, I guess they are under the control of the Iraqi army, but in any event, they're also seem to be our allies, or at least we're treating them like that. We are giving them military. We are bombing on their behalf, right? And that's one of the things you report. We're giving them air support.
Yeah, it's a bit complicated. So. The American idea is that you strengthen the Iraqi security forces, brigade by brigade, and eventually that becomes a strong enough institution that it can absorb the newly kind of invigorated Shiite militias. However, in Diyala, which is a very important front, which was like 3 weeks ago, a lot of key areas were controlled by this Islamic State. The commander of an Iraqi division, the Diyala police, as well as something called the Tigris Command Center, which I think is more impressive on paper than it is in reality. The guy in charge of that is Hadi al-Amri, who is the head of the Badr Brigade. He's a former transportation minister, but he's the head of a Shia militia, and the generals report to him, and they all told me, yes, we report to Hadi al-Amri. Now, Hadi al-Amri is not the most highest ranking military officer in all of Iraq, but he is controlling the battle space in a province that is north of Baghdad and is extremely important in the current war. And his men have already been accused of summary executions and all kinds of nasty stuff like that. When I interviewed him, he sort of first of all, he denied that any of these war crimes that are kind of coming out happened under his watch. But he did say, I am the commander of this area, and that is what I've got on the ground. And I think that's something that I found extraordinary, and I would imagine I don't know that it's penetrated in the Washington policy discussion, but if you're bombing on behalf of those fighting forces, you're effectively bombing on a force that is commanded by the head of the Badr Corps.
Right, and in some ways, it's a natural. Up to a point, it's a natural convergence of interest because we're opposed to ISIS. The Shiite brigades are opposed to, militias are opposed to ISIS. Iran is opposed to ISIS. There is that, to that extent, a natural convergence of interest. But we believe, and maybe some people in Iran believe, but certainly we believe that a looming peril is ongoing and even intensifying ethnic conflict within Iraq between Sunni and Shiites, and your reporting highlights some of the danger of getting on the side of the Shiite militias because you cite evidence that some of them are not so big on inter-ethnic outreach, you might say, to put it mildly.
Well, yeah, and this I just filed, which I think will be up by the time this comes out, is that one of the groups that's in the fight, called the League of the Righteous, or Hawk, they were responsible for a pretty horrific event, the murder of the 5 Marines in Karbala on the road. It was very public. I interviewed the spokesman.
This was when did this happen?
This is 06 or 07. I have to check. All my other internet stuff is down, but it's 07, I think. And I interviewed the spokesman of it. Not only, he said, listen, yeah, we did that. We're proud of the operation. Any American with a gun is still a target. And the leader of that group, Qais al-Khazali, doesn't have the same kind of command authority as Hadi al-Amri, but he is in the operation center with Iraqi generals and is certainly, an important kind of commander in this fight. So we have to accept the fact that the plan might be to absorb the militias, but right now, I think the Iraqi army, still devastated from the losses to the Islamic State in Mosul and Kirkuk, is I would say is less powerful right now than those militias, and that ought to be very. Also, because I don't believe in the kind of I don't want to get into. It's dangerous sort of logic to say that ISIS exists because of abuses from the Shia government in Iraq, or you can come up. They have all kinds of excuses, but at the same time, it's very difficult to get like Sunnis in Anbar to want to fight on the side of a government if they see that the army is being commanded by these very sectarian militias, which have committed atrocities against Sunnis in the past. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy towards kind of a civil war. And Iran, I think, is not interested in really unifying Iraq in this sense. What they're really interested in is supporting a kind of maximalist Shia rule. So that's the problem.
I mean, that's one interpretation. I would say that to me, what Iran is doing in trying to exert as much influence as possible in Iraq is just could be interpreted as just kind of statecraft 101. I mean, when Iraq was under Sunni control, it was a bitter enemy of Iran's. That's Iran's experience with an Iraq under Sunni control, was that it was very belligerent, and that led to a hugely costly war, costly for both sides in human and material terms. Then when suddenly, the governance of Iraq, things get more fluid because of our invasion of Iraq, suddenly who's going to control things in Iraq comes up for grabs. Well, naturally, Iran is going to exert as much influence as possible and I would have predicted that they do it in roughly the way they're doing it. So, I mean, I don't know why you'd be surprised, given the history between Iran and Iraq, that Iran is doing roughly what they're doing. Maybe you're not surprised, but it's not necessarily alarming, it seems to me.
I'm not surprised. I think Iran's doing something a little bit more sinister than just that. I mean, listen, they have any possible any possible prime minister of Iraq is going to be a Shia politician who is not interested in having a kind of war with them than what Saddam was. So, I mean, I should just, from the very beginning, that's not really in the cards. The idea that they're supporting groups that are going house to house and literally being accused now, it's the fog of war. I don't want to, but Human Rights Watch certainly thinks that, the fact that they're supporting the maximalist groups that are creating even more IDPs and driving Sunnis from these areas in a kind of ethnic cleanse, I don't see how that would just sort of be in their national interest.
Yeah. Now, let me say, Eli, the quality of your audio is approaching problematic proportions. I think there's a traffic jam in the Baghdad internet. I'm trying to think. Maybe we should. Let me say one thing, and then you can reply to it. And if your reply is unintelligible, on the one hand, I'll be happy about that because you may be disagreeing with me. But on the other hand, it will probably mean that we should switch to another mode of recording. So, the one thing I'd say is, I'm not saying Iran's, is pursuing merely the interest of ensuring Shiite control of Iraq. They have the further interest in minimizing the power of ISIS, because that to them is the Sunni Iraqi peril in other, or the Sunni peril in new clothing in terms of national security. So I would expect them to focus on both those things. But you're certainly right that when they are supporting groups that are, engaging in atrocities, anti-Sunni atrocities and stuff, that's something the United States doesn't want to see. I'm not sure whether Iran wants to see it or it's just a regrettable byproduct or what. I mean, I think both Iran and the U.S. are in the position where, well, right now, who's ready to fight ISIS? Who's ready to fight ISIS is Shia militias. America's goal is to ultimately integrate them into a larger Iraqi armed force that is at least substantially Sunni, because only a substantially Sunni armed force is going to ever win the trust of the people who are now under the control of ISIS and so on. Okay, we are back. And Eli, you, I think, had some replying to me that you wanted to do.
Yes. So you were making the point that, maybe it wouldn't be in Iran's interest, or that they could see my thing is that I think their national interest is to have, a country that won't invade them. And they certainly didn't want the American troops to be in Iraq. And that was, I think, an argument that was made by the Obama administration for why it wasn't so terrible that they left, that the U.S. left. But I would say that Iran's, I think Iran has got other interests in mind. I think that they're in a maximalist state right now, and they really are looking to exert control versus influence. And I just would say it's quite regrettable. The Iranian influence is in most senses in this country pernicious, and that the truth is that I think most Sunni Arabs are victims of ISIS. They're the first communities that are often taken over by these guys, and their ideology is often so strict and foreign in some ways, even though everyone's Sunni Muslim, I suppose. But it's really a shame. I think again, these are allegations at this point we're talking about. It's hard to sort of, I think we're starting to see it, but these claims are being made at this point. They're starting to be reported on. I would recommend a Reuters piece from this week. Human Rights Watch, I think, is coming out with something, and this is the influence of the Quds Force and Qasem Soleimani, because those are the groups that are most likely doing it. And I don't see how that's necessarily in their national interest. I think they can fight ISIS, and I think it's smarter to fight ISIS in a way that shows that they are not an existential threat to the Sunni Arab community. It's counterinsurgency 101.
Absolutely, and that's why I would need to be convinced that Iran is kind of actively supporting a lot of atrocities.
Well, we know that the groups that are very close to them are the ones that are consistently being accused of doing it. And they've done this kind of thing before. They did this before, you know, in the awful period of 05, 06, and 07, that these were called the special groups. The reason that those groups, in large part, became targets for the U.S. military is because they were seen as committing the same kinds of ethnic cleansing that al-Qaeda in Iraq and other groups like that were doing. And the problem is that when those become the only choices, then that is a recipe for competitive genocide. It's absolutely tragic to see it coming to this again. And Iran is not interested in. Iran is supporting those groups. That's who their guys are. And I mean,
well, we're supporting those groups. We're supporting those groups
well,
in the
not
sense
in the same way.
We're giving them air support.
We're not supporting them in the same way.
No, but we're giving them air support. I mean,
we are giving them air support, but it's not quite the same thing. And the U.S. policy is feckless in my maybe feckless isn't the right word, but it is anemic at this point. And Haider al-Abadi worries about this. I mean, he's been admirable in coming out and calling for an investigation into this latest allegation of 70 people being killed in Diyala, in a town in Diyala, and I think he's talked about how there's no place for this sort of thing. But
this is the Prime Minister of Iraq.
Yes,
right?
the Prime Minister of Iraq. So that's good news. But the people who are who have been supporting and had relationships with them, it's the Quds Force going back a long way. There's a huge difference there. Now, I think, you said something earlier, which I would sort of say, we are in a crisis emergency in the sense, I mean, it should not really need to be repeated, but the Islamic State is organized and beyond barbaric. I mean, I'm of the view, I'm with the King of Jordan. We can't coexist with them. They need to be wiped from the face of the earth.
Wait, who needs to be wiped from the face of the earth?
The Islamic State, ISIS, the Daesh.
Yeah, well, if you mean, well, we need to get rid of them somehow. We need to bring their influence in a direction of zero, and ideally to zero. But no.
I mean, I think this year the Nobel Peace Prize Committee should have a contest and say that whoever kills or captures the most ISIS leaders will win the prize. I mean, and I see it as a humanitarian act. And I also would say this. I think that Iran is a threat to U.S. interests in a lot of ways, and a serious threat, and as a state power, is more powerful than ISIS as well.
A threat to the security of the United States in any meaneful sense, like an actual threat to me sitting here in the United States.
Well, you're sort of like let's before we get to my setup here is that I don't think Iran is interested in doing the kinds of things that the Islamic State wants to do, which is to kind of create massacres in Toronto and Sydney and Paris and New York and so forth.
Right.
At least I don't think that that's the case. I think that they're like, I think the Iranians are an enemy, and it would be a disaster to let them
what
get a
form does the
nuclear
enemy
weapon.
take? But in what sense are they a threat to me?
Well, I mean, to you.
Well, to Americans. I mean, and I think of national security as keeping Americans safe. What threat do they pose to Americans? What?
Well, first of all, they've supported groups for 30 years that have killed Americans, whether that's the special groups in Iraq or Hezbollah.
Well, come on. But again, I mean, Iraq, we invaded Iraq and became a national security problem for them. Naturally, they supported the insurrection.
Bob, this is bullshit. No offense, but I mean, come on.
What do you mean?
Like, Iran is not Iraq. I mean, why do you keep giving them a pass?
We've
to
already...
their interests? They should be able to. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. The Iranians also invaded Iraq, and they are invading Iraq right now. Iran is not Iraq. That is, they don't have a right to go into Iraq.
Eli, if somebody,
Americans, and I mean, it's like it's
Eli. Let me
just
ask you a question. If somebody we considered an enemy in the way that we in Iran considered each other's enemies 15 years ago, invaded Mexico and took over, you don't, like Russia. Suppose Russia invaded Mexico and took over. You don't think we would support the insurgency, and you don't think the insurgency would do some horrible things in the process? We've supported Latin American insurgencies that raped and killed nuns, for God's sake, when there wasn't any meaningful threat to America's security.
Well, first of all, I would not have supported the death squads in El Salvador. Is what you're referring to.
My point is just, it's how America behaves historically. The way you're accusing Iran of behaving is how America historically behaves, even when there are threats much less tangible than Iran had reason to consider the threat posed by America's invasion of Iraq.
Okay, but the problem here is also how they've chosen to go about doing that. And the fact is that, you know, we were taking out one of their main rivals. And for most of that invasion, we sent messages directly and indirectly telling them that we wanted to work with them. And I just think it's far more complicated. And finally, I don't think the Americans would support an insurgency that was committing the kinds of acts of terrorism that the Iranians did. I mean, I just think that it's a kind of species of relativism. And then finally, I think Iran poses a threat to all of our allies in the region, not just Israel. It poses a threat to the United Arab Emirates. It poses a threat to Saudi Arabia. One could argue maybe it's not, our alliance with Saudi Arabia is not such a great thing because Saudi Arabia exports an extremist ideology, which is very close to what ISIS is all about. That's true. But I mean, and it's just the Iranians are enemies like all over the region. They are countering us everywhere we go. Everything that's like kind of on our camp, they're against them. They've been willing to use terrorism as a means of statecraft, which is to a degree that we haven't.
Eli, I'm sure you know that their reliance on terrorist attacks was much greater 20, 30 years ago than it is now. And in the last 20 years, I mean, aside from the conflict between Iran-supported militias in Iraq, which we invaded, and us, aside from that, there just hasn't been much of that stuff, right?
Right.
I mean, in the last 20 years of like Iran supporting groups that were killing Americans around, it just basically has not been happening.
Okay, this is Iran is a state, and particularly its Quds Force, in Syria, is supporting the barrel bombing of whole villages. That's a death toll of over 200,000. Iran continues to support terrorist organizations in Lebanon. They continue to support all of these groups. I mean,
let's take these one at a time. Let's take these one at a time.
Yeah.
The bad thing about barrel bombs is that it's indiscriminate force that kills a lot of civilians. We've done that in our history, but also recently supported. I mean, for God's sake, the Ukrainian government is pretty crude in its use of force in populated areas, and we support them. I mean, you know,
first of all, we haven't really supported the
Ukrainian
government. We haven't done nearly as much as what the Iranians have done for Syria. And it's incomparable to compare the Ukrainian response to an invasion by Russia to Iran's response to propping up a dictator that is in the process of killing 300,000 people. I mean, it's not comparable. I think that these kinds of comparisons
Eli, look at the atrocities committed by the rebels on the Syrian side, and we support the rebels.
Well,
I mean, it's a mess.
That's a little bit simplistic. First of all, I don't think we've really supported anybody. Obama's policy has been to stay out of it.
Okay, but you wish we would support them, and they have killed a lot of innocent people and done horrible things.
Oh, obviously, one of those rebels is ISIS, but I'm saying that Obama has decided, the policy has been to try to support and carve out support for moderate rebels. Very little has been done, as story after story shows, that any of the commanders that we think are moderate enough to support always are complaining that they're vastly outgunned and don't have nearly as much support. So for the most part, the United States has really stayed on the sidelines in the middle of this kind of crisis. But Iran has chosen a side, and the side that they've chosen is a vicious dictator that has committed one of the great humanitarian
of course
catastrophes of the 21st century.
Eli,
you seem to be thinking that that like, oh, they really are getting. I mean, they're moderating.
Eli,
this is a
moralism,
real moral failing of progressives.
Eli, give me a break. Of course they haven't stayed on the sidelines. It's their neighborhood. It's a country adjacent to them. And as for the fact that their moral scruples tend to get a little relaxed when their national security is at stake, that distinguishes them from who exactly? Certainly not the United States. Remember Hiroshima? Have you heard of Hiroshima? I mean, give me a break.
Okay, you want to bring up Hiroshima? It was ending World War II. I mean, but this is a moral relativism, which I'm frankly kind
it's
of
not a moral
surprised to
relativism.
It is. It's moral relativism, and frankly, I think it really does leave progressives to the point where
I'm not morally relativistic. I'm saying that historically we have done things as bad as the things that you're saying are just beyond the pale because somebody you don't like is doing them now.
I believe that American statecraft, not always and not all the time.
I'm against both of them. I don't think we should have bombed Hiroshima.
That's great, but I'm saying I think that this is like self-marginalizing and a little bit vain. And I think it's like this reasoning, and I hear it a lot from especially academics and very smart people and kind of intellectuals. It's just, we're in the middle of a catastrophe right now in the Middle East. Everything is sort of changing. And Iran is one of the reasons, is one of the arsonists.
No,
okay?
you know what another reason is, Eli? Exactly the kind of moralizing you're doing now, but then it was directed at Saddam Hussein, and then it was the reason we had to invade. And that's the reason ISIS exists, because of the invasion you wanted, which was based on exactly this kind of moralizing that just blinds people to all kinds of practical considerations about what is actually achievable and what the blowback will be, and so on. This is the kind of rhetoric that started this mess.
If you wish that Saddam was still in power, and you think that he would have, that regime would have stayed in power,
it's hard to imagine that being worse. I'm not at all sure the regime would have stayed in power, actually, and that's one reason I think patience might have been in order. But I certainly cannot imagine, if he had stayed in power, any probability of things being as bad as they are right now, that we've seen what our invasion of Iraq unleashed, which includes the very creation of ISIS.
Okay, first of all, the creation of ISIS, first of all, America tried to fight them. Its forerunner in Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
After creating them? I mean,
second of all, if you want to look at some sort of precedent, I mean, like as I said, I don't think that the invasion of Iraq, I really frankly don't even understand that, because, first of all, I think that there were enormous mistakes the United States made in Iraq until finally getting to a counterinsurgency strategy. But one mistake that was made was the decision for Barack Obama to treat Iraq like a normal nation and to allow Maliki to do a series of things which alienated the Sunni population, including not paying the salaries of a lot of these Anbari sheikhs that eventually came to our side of things. But, so if you wanted to sort of figure out, what was necessarily responsible for it, it's, I wouldn't necessarily go back to, the invasion of Iraq, but more to the point that you're making. I don't like the excuse making for Iran. I don't get it. I think it's something
I'm not making excuses, Eli.
You are.
I'm not
You're
making
saying it's
excuses.
in their national interest. You're saying that, of course, they would do it. It's in their neighborhood. They're no better than America. They're no worse than America. I mean, give me a break, Bob. That you are apologizing for an absolutely venal regime that is lighting a fire on the region right now. And the only thing you can say is that it's Hiroshima. What about the invasion of
first of all, Eli,
Abu Ghraib?
First of all,
yada, yada, yada. And it's like, that's self-marginalizing, Bob. It's one of the reasons why academics in Middle East studies are not taken seriously anymore.
Eli, I'm waiting for you to calm down. Have you calmed down? Look, I'm not making excuses for anybody. And in fact, one of the greatest impediments to rational discourse is exactly what you just did, which is that anytime you just try to come up with a causal explanation of what happened, which, by the way, is the beginning of intelligent analysis, you say, oh, you're making excuses for them. And I don't know, what is the alternative? That there were no causal forces involved in getting Iran to do what it's doing? I'm just trying to, A, start out by explaining why I think they're doing what they're doing, and then B, point out that if you look at it rationally and understand things from the point of view of their national interest, which is not to excuse anything they do, it does at least allow you to put things in proportion. Their goal is not to destroy America or even to attack America or to attack Saudi Arabia, as you earlier implied. You don't have to extrapolate that far to explain what they've actually done. What they are doing is, however, in some cases brutally, and again, America has been brutal quite often in the past, but however brutally, pursuing their national interest as they see it, and there's no reason to expect them to go beyond the pursuit of their national interest, whereas you seem to think they're going to go beyond their pursuing their national security, and that's what we all have to worry about. I just don't agree.
I believe that they are interested in they're expansionists. They're a revolutionary regime, and they're interested in ultimately having a kind of control in the region. And I suppose you can sort of chalk that up to their national interest, which is a pretty amorphous word. I mean, I don't think it really says that much.
Are they more expansionist than the U.S. has historically been?
I think they would have been able to. I think that it's in their national interest to have been far more transparent about their nuclear program and to put aside their fantasies about how everyone's trying to attack them all the time and taken advantage of the numerous amount of outreach that the West has given them over the years. But they've chosen instead to pursue a kind of maximalist and revolutionary agenda. So I don't think that it's the beginning of analysis or understanding.
Eli, let's be clear. Let's be clear. The nuclear deal that we may be close to, assuming Bibi Netanyahu and his allies in the United States do not succeed in blowing it out of the water, which they are clearly trying to do, that would involve extreme transparency, unprecedented transparency, this nuclear deal. It would allow inspectors to go, to do off-site inspections and so on. It would probably be the most transparent inspection regime in place anywhere in the whole world. So let's be clear on that, okay?
What?
You just said,
Bob,
why doesn't Iran...
You have no idea what's going to be in that deal, and neither do I.
Well, we know. Well, no, we do know some things. We do know some things.
No, we don't. They don't. The whole thing is a secret right now.
No, it is reliably reported that it would.
Reliably reported? I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. Why? If it was such a wonderful deal, then why aren't they sharing it? The details with anybody? I mean, they have to go in a secret room in Congress to look at it. I mean, and they don't.
It's called negotiations, Eli, and negotiations are never conducted under transparency, for God's sake, because then nothing would happen. Give me a break. Now, let me finish my sentence.
But I don't know what it is. You seem to be telling me how great it is, and you don't know what it is yet.
I can confidently tell you one thing. If there's a deal, it would involve Iran signing on to what's called the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty,
yes,
which you're not required to sign on to as a member of the NPT. But I predict that a deal would involve Iran signing into that, and that does entail off-site inspections, and I suspect there will be even things beyond that.
Bob, why do you care? They're just pursuing their national interest. If they get a nuclear weapon, and of course, we do bad things, they do bad things. I mean, why do you care if they get a nuclear weapon? I mean, why do you care?
I'm actually not that worried. I'd rather they didn't have a nuclear weapon.
The leaders of the Green Movement, by the way, are still under house arrest, but I guess that's in their national interest. Why do you care? I mean, hey, they're just pursuing. Hey, we put bad guys in jail. We had Guantanamo. What about that?
Well, as for if you're asking me why that doesn't make me worry more about Iran having a nuclear weapon, first of all, again, I'd rather they didn't have one. If you ask me why I'm not nearly as worried as you, it's because, to take a parallel example, Russia's an incredibly repressive regime as well, but I don't recall them nuking anyone. There's no rational reason to expect a correlation between your domestic human rights policy and the rationality of your foreign policy, rationality defined as national self-interest. Russia's not crazy. They haven't nuked anybody. Iran's not crazy.
They just invaded
They're not going to nuke anybody.
They're occupying Georgia, and they are threatening every independent country in the entire region.
And they're getting away with it.
They are getting away with it.
There's no national suicide being committed.
I wish they didn't have nuclear weapons, but I guess we have to blame the Rosenbergs for that. Or do you want to tell me why they were really innocent and they were framed?
Wait, Eli, could you explain the bizarre tangent you just went out on? I literally don't understand. Why are you bringing that up?
I'm amazed, Bob. I really think that you've been brainwashed by
what are you talking about? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Why did you bring that up?
I'm still stunned from this very blasé thing. To me, it's kind of, listen, I have become, from when we started doing Blogging Heads, I will acknowledge the following, okay? I think that I have really come to accept the limits of American power, particularly in the realm of nation building and particularly in this region. So over time, and one of the reasons I like to be a reporter is that I don't have to come up with exact policies and as a journalist. But I do think, and you know, we haven't spoken in a while, but I see an element of the kind of academic left. It's the crowd that goes on this thing. I'm not on it, but I've heard about it in Gulf 2000. And it's a group of kind of policy intellectuals that, in my view, have just become apologists for a grave threat to the values that I would like to think we both hold dear, and that is Iran. And I think that at some point people are going to wake up and they're going to realize that as Iran was marching towards trying to consolidate its influence, which I think is genuinely negative, not just because they in their bones want to destroy Israel, and not just because they're bad on human rights, and not just because they support ethnic cleansers in Iraq and a horrible dictator in Syria, and I could go on. But I just think that it's not only in our interest. I just think that at a fundamental level, it's really one of the more atrocious regimes that's on the planet right now. And there is a kind of group of writers and intellectuals and academics who do nothing but apologize for it. And it's stunning
Eli,
to me.
come on, Eli, that's not honest of you. That's not honest.
I think it's
just
a form
told
of
you.
apology.
I'm not
trying to be, and I don't want to personalize it, but it is to me
No.
a great failing of progressives today that they are willing to make excuse after excuse for Iran, and it's stunning. I don't get it. I don't get it. Why are you not screaming at the top of your lungs
do you understand
that
the
leaders
distinction?
of the Green Movement should be released? Why are you not screaming at the top of your lungs that they should stop executing gay people all the time? Why are you screaming at the top of your lungs that they should stop supporting the worst militias in Iraq?
I wish they would.
Okay.
I wish tons of things would happen in the world, okay? But let's get back to this business of, but I am powerless to influence that right now, and I suspect the United States is. But let's get back to this apologist business, okay?
Yeah.
I just want to distinguish between apologizing for their behavior on the one hand, and two other things that I have done. One is try to get clear on what their motivation is and ask whether what they're doing can be explained as their pursuit, in their own eyes, of their own national security, and and B, to just kind of remind you that I don't see a qualitative moral difference between a lot of the stuff you complain about and the kinds of things the United States has in fact historically done. I'm sorry. But neither of those things is apologizing. If I supported the things that America has done that I consider in some ways analogous, then it would be apologizing. But I'm not apologizing for either country. I'm just suggesting that a little more detachment would be fruitful on your part, and a little less American exceptionalism, a little less blindness to America's own sins, and a little more realism and less moralism.
Well, I don't think it's realism. I think it's neutralism. And I do think that the United States, at the end of the day, fights for something that is better for the world and leads to more stability than what Iran does. I don't think that they're just sort of, hey, countries do bad stuff, they're acting in their national interest. And we
always say that we're doing these things for the greatest reasons, but they always backfire on us. The Afghanistan intervention in the Soviet era basically created single-handedly Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the long run, and you can just take it out from there. Everything we do blows up in our face when we follow the guidance of people like you. I'm sorry, I admit I didn't oppose that intervention at the time, but I now understand that, as American interventions tend to do, it didn't make things better.
See, I would argue that the precipitous withdrawal and the premature withdrawal is what, in large part, and also the sort of the change in policy to basically continue to arm Maliki as he became consolidated power, became something of a Shia Saddam.
Well, they did kick us out of the country. They did tell us to leave, okay? The government did not want us to stay.
Made it clear that we were uninterested, really, in a serious security framework. I mean, if you read, oh God, why am I blanking on the book? The New York Times reporter Michael Gordon's book has a great kind of history of all of this stuff. But Maliki was interested in having a long-term strategic partnership with the United States that we largely rejected. And when we did come back with how many troops that we thought we would want, that's when he adopted that kind of stance. And that led to the scenario that I think Obama wanted. He wanted to fulfill this campaign promise, and Maliki provided him, and then turned much more towards Iran. In 2007, Maliki took on these special groups. By the way, even over, without even informing at first Crocker and Petraeus, who were in the country. And Maliki obviously turned out to be a pretty bad bet in a lot of ways. I don't think every American intervention is always wrong. I do think that I'm certainly not as gung-ho about it as I used to be. In the following sense is that I do think that there's just certain things that we're no good at. And there might be more effective ways of sort of supporting things. But overall, I remain an American exceptionalist because I think that the American hegemony, which is now breaking apart in the Middle East and before our eyes in Europe and everywhere, is falling apart. The era that's going to come next is going to be a lot worse, and it's going to be a lot worse in terms of the values that I know you and I both cherish. And that is, I think, in part because of, sadly, the influence of people who believe that there's just nothing we can ever do. And I don't think that that's really the lesson here. And I think we're really going to come to regret it. I think we're going to come to regret it in our lifetime. And I think that there may be nothing we can do, but this new era, when America is not going to be the same kind of superpower, is going to, I think, lead to more instability, more bloodshed, and a suffocation of more rights. And
well,
I think you're really going to regret it, Bob. I mean, it's not.
Eli, this just seems so strange to me because, okay, let's look at the consequences of America having been what you apparently want it to be, the superpower that flexes its muscles when it wants to and intervenes where it wants to. I mean, what was the last intervention that worked out well? Even the Afghanistan invasion, I was earlier talking about the Soviet-era proxy intervention, but the invasion after 9/11, and if ever there was a morally and legally justified war, that was it. I admit it. I don't have any problems with it on those grounds, but it has made things, it seems to me, certainly not better and arguably worse. The Iraq invasion has definitely just created a hornet's nest. It's just a disaster. And so you'll forgive people like me for being skeptical when people like you say, no, let's keep doing this. I mean, it's not only didn't work, it created the problems that we're grappling with. ISIS did not exist before, the precursor of ISIS was this, they were like, I don't know, I guess off in Jordan with some grievance about the Jordanian government or something, and then we create this field of chaos in Iraq that invites them to come in and multiply.
Well, no, the precursor of ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Well, no, the precursor of ISIS came, well, yes, but what is the precursor of that? Where were they before we invaded Iraq? They did not exist meaningfully in Iraq before we invaded.
Well, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi did go to Iraq before the invasion, though it was at a time when it was pretty clear America was going to invade. And Saddam also let out all of his prisoners.
Whatever, you know what I'm saying? The invasion created the breeding ground. We shouldn't have to argue about this, Eli. Come on.
I don't believe that. I just think it's a little bit too pat because there was a problem of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were defeated. And then we bugged out. And surprise, surprise, and we didn't pressure Maliki.
Yeah, everything was great, and we left.
No, it wasn't everything was great, but I'm saying they were defeated, and then what are the causes of how they were able to come back? And was there anything we could have done that would have stopped it? Now, I have to say I don't like counterfactuals, but Bob, I mean, I think this is a much, I mean, they were defeated, and then we left, and then Maliki decided to fire all the competent generals and replace them with corrupt cronies. We said nothing. We did nothing. We didn't have.
And he was, by the way, installed by George Bush, so he was the American guy. We put him. We liked him. We liked him. He was our guy. He was elected, but he was our guy. We supported him, and you know that he was our guy.
There's a huge difference. Okay, that the result of No, it's a huge difference. The result of the U.S. intervention in Iraq were elections and a new constitution and the end of Saddam Hussein, all of which are positives. But, anyway, that's a very important distinction.
There's only so much time we should spend relitigating the Iraq War. But let me ask you this. Just review something we probably agree on. Okay, so, first of all, whatever you think of Iran, the American military seems to think that what you consider proxies of Iran, these militias, are at least for the time being kind of useful de facto allies. Now, I assume their thinking is, look, in the short run, they're the only guys willing and able to fight right now in Iraq, basically. We got to live with that. In the long run, we hope to create, again, an armed force with a meaningful Sunni contingent that will not be seen as threatening by the Sunnis who feel threatened who are under ISIS's control and feel threatened by a largely Shia government in Iran, right? That's the challenge.
I think Americans are, when they talk to me on background, very uncomfortable by the role of the militias, but because they are trying to stop the advance of the Islamic State, which is another great threat, which we haven't spent as much time talking about. They are willing to work with them when they're embedded and working with the Iraqi military, and even and I think someone like Hadi al-Amri, even though his men have done terrible things and he has very close ties with Qasem Soleimani, are seen as not as bad as the League of the Righteous or Iraqi Hezbollah or other groups that were more extreme than even him. So, but they're very uncomfortable with it. And I quoted Mike Flynn, the former DIA director, as well as you spent 3 years in Iraq, Special Operations General. He said, we're in a de facto alliance with Iran. And this leads to this other question, which is, it looks like, some people have written recently, I think Mike Duran wrote something for Mosaic saying that Obama wants this kind of new partnership with Iran. I don't know if I would necessarily go that far. I think that it's hard to discern a grand direction or strategy from this White House. I think a lot of it is reactive. But it is a problem. The problem is that we don't have as much influence now, because we are out of here. We're in weird. I would just say I think in Iraq it would have been much better to have 20,000 troops and to continue to use means of pressure on Maliki to save him from himself and not do the kinds of things that led to the jailbreaking of the Al Qaeda leaders and all the things that sort of replenished the ranks of ISIS and so forth. And the other thing is that by doing so little in Syria. And this is not just, me saying this, it's, Petraeus and Hillary Clinton, lots of people in 2012, banged the table and urged Obama to more seriously fund the moderate Syrian opposition so that there would be an alternative between Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, and ISIS and al-Nusra. And Obama decided to sort of stay out of it.
Here's the deal about Syria, and now we're back to relitigating things, but at least it's something other than the Iraq War now. Here's the problem I see with this argument that, if only we had intervened. Now, there's in Syria, there's actually a form of intervention that I think would have been better than what we did. I just think it's not the same form of intervention as you would have favored. The form of intervention I think you would have favored is to say what Obama said, which is that Assad must go, we must have regime change, except back it up by actually supporting the rebels. And I would just remind you that so far, our record with insisting on regime change and getting it is not good. We did that in Iraq, total disaster. We did it in Libya, seems to have all the earmarks of a burgeoning disaster. I think if we have learned nothing else, we should have learned that, regime change can create things worse than the regime itself. The form of intervention in Syria that I think might have made sense is to say, okay, maybe Assad can maintain control of some of Syria. Maybe there's going to be a partition. and deal with him on those terms. That's the one thing I can imagine that, in conjunction with supporting the rebels, might have led to an end to the bloodshed. But nothing in recent history leads us to believe that insisting on regime change, as I assume you would have wanted to do, and as Obama was doing, that would have led to anything good.
Well, I mean, it's sort of one of the things that I like being, as I said, I like being a journalist because I have the luxury of not having to have clearly defined points. But on Libya, I would just say, they supported regime change because, and Obama was somewhat reluctant on this, was because, it was clear that Gaddafi was about to wipe out a city of 500,000 people in Benghazi, which became famous later on.
Right, and they got UN authorization to stop that, but then they exceeded the UN's mandate and went for regime change, and that's when things got out of hand. But go ahead.
Well, so you would have stopped him in Benghazi, but, I mean, all right.
I would not have exceeded the UN's mandate.
All right, well, I guess my point here is I do think that it's dangerous when you call for regime change in the sense that you have to back it up and you should go into it knowing that it is a very significant commitment. But in my view, the real sin of Libya was the notion that we were going to lead from behind, that we were going to create a vacuum and not do anything significant to try to fill that vacuum. And I would say the same problem in a different way happened in Iraq, in that we got out too quickly and we didn't exert as much influence. We've gone over that. And as far as Syria goes, I mean, I suppose letting him keep part of the state or something like that, if he would have gone for that, might have been the right move. I mean, it's hard for me to kind of get into the what it should have could is, but I do think that, kind of back to the larger point, you can also have a pretty high death toll. You talk about the wages of intervention. I would say the wages of non-intervention, the wages of sitting on the sideline and doing nothing. Syria is kind of a case in point in that, when his national security cabinet was saying you have to do something, you've got to create an alternative, and Obama really didn't listen. He didn't do it, and we're dealing with those consequences now. It's a collapsed state. We're still the superpower.
All I would say is, if the problem in Libya is that we didn't try to fill the vacuum, it just seems that we tried damn hard to fill the vacuum in both Iraq and in Afghanistan after the 2001 invasion, and disaster ensued. So I'm just saying, we don't know how to fill the vacuum. So this counterfactual, where if we had supported the rebels in Syria and deposed the regime, everything would be great, that just flies in the face of all the relevant data we actually have.
I'm just saying that there's no that any decent moderate opposition doesn't exist because we didn't take that side. And so the extremists filled the void. The Qataris, and to a degree at some points the Saudis, supported the ISIS and those people, or maybe not directly ISIS, but other kinds of extreme groups. And then we had Iran and Russia supporting Assad. And the result was not only the bloodshed and the refugees and all of the other humanitarian horrors, but also this collapsed state that has, kind of created what we're now dealing with as this Islamic State. And sooner or later, I think we're going to end up having to get involved in a more significant way, as Obama did this summer, because ISIS needs to be defeated, and not even Iran and its militias alone can defeat it. They still need American power to do it. It's just, unfortunately, in Iraq right now, the Iranians have made such headway that it has forced this alliance in some ways with the Iranians, which, as I see, is not a very good thing.
Well, I'm not optimistic about the outcome, although my lack of optimism doesn't have so much to do with Iranian intentions as with the inherent problem. But
I think you're way too trusting of the Iranians, but we've been over this, I suppose.
Well, I'm no more or less trusting of them than I am of other human beings, I guess I'd say. But
it's amazing. It's like oh well, I suppose I don't know. I don't want to get into it. I think you're too blasé.
Well, no, but I mean, as people in the region go, I mean, you said they threaten our allies, Saudi Arabia. You're putting Saudi Arabia on a higher plane than Iran? Really? Seriously?
No, no. Saudi Arabia beheads people just like ISIS. They export the same Salafist, and so, anyway.
And they're at least as repressive domestically as
I think the United Arab Emirates
or Egypt. Let's look at Egypt. I'm just saying, like, you know, I don't get, you know, the Iran obsession. There's a lot of people with values that don't meet my approval in the world. A lot of countries.
Well, I do think that we're seeing the breaking up of the American kind of led order.
Yeah.
That is something that is happening. I'm here reporting on it as I see it. You are there, you know, kind of writing and thinking about it. But this is sort of a process that is happening. And I think that you're not going to like what comes next.
I think that's the one thing
you're going to miss the days of George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan.
I'm going to miss the days of George W. Bush. I'm going to miss the days of the guy who decided to invade Iraq.
When America was a strong power and that it could actually try to shape these world and try to sort of lead a world order, which it's I think we're seeing America that collapse.
I will never miss the days of George W. Bush. Let me ask you one more question quickly. You know, we're running out of time, but so this horrific burning of the Jordanian pilot.
Yes.
What do you think that says about what are they thinking when they do that? I mean, what tactical purpose do they think of it as happening, assuming it has one? And do you think it's going to backfire on them?
I have to say, the more I find, I have a lot of material on ISIS and their foreign fighters in my notebook. I don't want to venture a guess as to, I know that there's some people who think it means they're desperate and they're alienating the Japanese, and now they're alienating the Bedouin tribes of Jordan, and they're going to alienate the Hashemite dynasty. Certainly has had that effect. King Abdullah has had very strong rhetoric. It seems like he's going to redouble efforts against them. But, you know, I also think that they're fairly formidable and resilient force, not just because they were able to take on the Iraqi army, but they are able to hold territory in a way that al-Qaeda never did, and that's a major innovation. And I don't believe that Mosul is soon going to fall. Maybe it will, but I don't know that's the case. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It gets into this kind of... I'm still somewhat baffled by them, and I can tell you I talked to a lot of security leaders in Iraq and Kurdistan who I've came away thinking they don't really understand the enemy that much either. And that's the truth. I mean, it's so I'm wary of analysts who say this is what it means. I think they want to not only intimidate populations, they want to insert themselves into important kinds of regional political debates. I mean, why do they spend all this time trying to take Kobane, which is not very valuable in any strategic sense? One explanation I heard is because they wanted to try to create a wedge between a very conservative Turkish Muslim population and the Erdogan government, which we in the West are kind of horrified by a lot of things he does, but, you know, could be perceived as being too soft on the Kurds. And so, you know, that was more that made more sense than some of the other conspiracy theories that I've heard about ISIS, which probably don't bear repeating on blogging heads. But
I'd love to hear them. Where else? If not blogging heads, where are you going to hear them?
Kurdish leaders will say, well, I mean, so here's something interesting about Kurdistan, that they are doing enormous business right now with Turkey, who is their old nemesis. But they also, a lot of them kind of secretly think that they're taking direction from the Turkish intelligence service. Then there's a theory that you'll hear from extremist Shia types that actually the United States is supporting ISIS, and they invent propaganda about it, saying that the U.S. is, you know, dropping,
I think we can definitely take that one off the table, but go ahead.
Well, we can, but it's something that you'll hear in Iraq. Mm-hmm. You know, everyone's kind of favorite regional villain. I've heard Israel's behind ISIS, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, like, you know, so you hear it. It's like it's because I think we're still in this phase where they don't understand. Well, the Kurds really don't know why ISIS decided to go for Erbil. They thought they were going to go for, you know, in and around Baghdad. Again, Kobani is kind of a mystery. Why do they want to take Kobani? So and the other thing I just say is that ISIS has come out with new currency, and apparently their highest note or coin, because they believe in only Quranic currency, it has a picture of the world on it. They seek this kind of world domination, and I don't think I don't think they can take over the whole world. I'm not saying that, but to just say, oh, they're a bunch of sort of Luddites in their caves in Afghanistan or whatever, they're not really a threat. Don't hype the threat. We should be very worried. I mean, this is this kind of thing that it appeals to these, like, losers, loners in the West. They are able to radicalize them on the web, and I think sadly that their goal in some ways is to have the ability to sort of create these mass atrocities, at home for us in the West. So we have to worry about them.
Well, I think just to touch on a couple of your points, I think as far as Turkey goes, I don't buy the conspiracy theory. I do think that Erdogan worries about the fact that ISIS probably has some support among some Turks, and not necessarily Turks who embrace atrocity, and they may have less support now that they burned this pilot than they had before. But I think Erdogan worries a little about that, and that's probably a constraint on him. As for Kobani, it doesn't surprise me they made a big deal about that, because you could equally well ask, well, why did the United States make a big deal about it? Very little strategic significance in that town. But once, and the answer is, it was important to ISIS because it was important to us, and it was important to us because it was important to ISIS. In other words, the more, although it is symbolic, the more intensely symbolic it gets, the more it actually matters. It is a real propaganda setback for them that they got evicted from Kobani. So that doesn't really shock me. They really wanted to be able to say that they prevailed in the face of intense American bombing, and they thought they could pull it off. They failed. As for the logic behind this horrible thing with the Jordanian pilot, I would guess, first of all, they may have made what I hope is a miscalculation about how the Jordanian population would react. It's certainly true there's ambivalence within Jordan about the Jordanian government's involvement in the anti-ISIS alliance, and ISIS was not hallucinating to see that and to want to exploit it. I hope it's a miscalculation to think that they helped their cause by burning this poor guy. But the other thing I would say is it just makes me think that their top priority right now is to recruit the most hardcore killers in the world. Maybe they're not going to get a lot of them, but they want, that's the kind of person who, if you ask who's going to see this guy burning and go, yeah, I want to join that cause, well, it's going to be some guy who's crazy by our lights and is willing to do horrible things and is willing to die himself. And that's the only logic I can really see.
Yeah, agreed. I think that there is something to that. They're pretty explicit about what they want. I don't know. I've spent enough time in the Middle East. As you know, I lived in Cairo for a while, and I go on these. I don't think most Arabs, I don't think most Muslims really want to live in their world, and in
the ISIS world.
No, I don't. It's one of the things that bothers me about something on the right. I know that I was sort of your stand-in American exceptionalist for this Blocking Heads, and we had some heated exchange earlier. But I mean, the one thing that really bothers me about the right is the idea that is to sort of write off everyone and to say, oh, well, that's just Islam. When I have not had that experience.
Yeah, I don't think, and that gets back to the challenge we started with, which is, how do you take these Sunnis living under ISIS control, who do not like living under ISIS control, and make them feel sufficiently unthreatened by the alternative to actually help in getting rid of ISIS? And that's, and I think you're right to be very, very concerned if
we started off and then we veered into this whole thing because I can't hear it when you're like, oh, the Iranians and their national interest. I mean, I'm still so disappointed. Anyway,
we're back to square one, and we're back to a note of agreement. Isn't it wonderful, Eli, about how we vigorously express our differences of opinion?
Express, yes. I was not expecting
hurl insults and slurs at one another.
We did.
But in the end,
we can agree.
We can agree that I am right and you are not.
We can agree to be civil.
That's the beauty of America.
We can agree to be civil.
That can happen. In America, any boy can grow up to be you and be wrong. And that is American exceptionalism to me, Eli.
All right. Well, Khamenei thanks you.
I'll let you. You know what?
I felt like I had to come up with a zinger.
I'm gonna let you get by with that shot.
No,
I'm gonna turn the other cheek. You can't see me, but I'm turning the other cheek.
Nice to do it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eli. I hope this won't be. How long are you going to be in Iraq?
I'm finishing my kind of 2 weeks now, and I go back my morning tomorrow. I actually go back and I have to leave in about probably 5 or 6 hours. I'm debating whether I should sleep for a couple hours or not.
Wow. Well, thank you then, all the more for taking the time.
No, I was really happy to do it. I mean, I should say, I was much more optimistic the last time we did one of these from Iraq.
Hmm. Well, you should lobby.
I think the state is I think Iraq is breaking apart. That's my sadly.
Well, that is depressing.
Yeah. Okay.
Which there are forms of partition that wouldn't be actually horrible, I think, but I don't think this is going to be one of them. Silver
lining is Kurdistan.
What's that?
The silver lining, if there's a Kurdish state, I think that would be a general
long-standing favorite of yours, I know. And look, it's islands of stability are better than not. But anyway, you should lobby David Shipley to send you to another exotic locale so that we can have you on Blogging Heads again.
All right. Well, David, if you watch us to the end, send me to another exotic locale.
Unlikely. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eli.
Okay.